They were literally sued twice for these portrayals. This is just a downright insulting portrayal of an actual armed force. A levitating minigun on horseback. Where are the physics? This is a purposeful, one-sided, biased depiction of a real, lesser-known historical war.
They found where I was being held prisoner with a spy satellite. One of them KH-9s.
The last KH-9 satellite was successfully launched on the 25th of June 1984, with it decaying in that same year. However, this mission, where Woods was captured in Angola and later found by the satellite, take place in 1986, 2 years after the last successful KH-9 mission.
And the C-130 comes by, snags it at about 30,000 feet.
Well, Woods, that is not a C-130. It is in fact a Boeing C-17 Globemaster III, which incorrectly has turboprops rather than the jet engines it actually had. Even worse, the C-17's appearance here is anachronistic, as its first flight was not until 1991, 5 years after the mission's setting. The intro cutscene for this level shows that the mission takes place in Jamba, which is located in the Cuando-Cubango province, not the Queen province that it states at the start of the mission. Unlike their fairly decent impression of JFK in the previous Black Ops game, it is clear that the game creators did not try to create an accurate voice for Jonas Savimbi here, instead going for a more powerful sound. Although Savimbi did actually speak English, in game he is voiced by an American actor and is given a dramatically deeper voice.
Mason! They wanna fight! We give them a fight! Move out!
In comparison to his real voice and of course Angolan accent.
Our uniforms. You cannot find a different uniform. This one I'm wearing, it is a French, but we bought it with our money. The other one is a Portuguese, we don't have a third one.
Mortify me, the MPLA is ready for attack!
Despite all the Angolan background soldiers speaking Portuguese, Savimbi only speaks English when talking directly to his soldiers or rallying them before battle. The Portuguese that the Angolans speak in game also have Brazilian characteristics, as they were seemingly voiced by Brazilians. In addition, it is worth mentioning that although Portuguese is the country's official main language, Angola is also home to many other widely spoken ethnic languages, especially in rural areas, including Umbundu, Kikongo, and Kimbundu, with the most widely spoken national language in the mission's province of Coin being Kwanyama. All of these, however, do not feature in-game. The soldiers of the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, led under Jonas Savimbi, are shown all wearing American OG 107 uniforms with Rhodesian brushstroke camo in-game, whereas in reality they mostly just wore solid olive, while most of the few camouflage patterns they actually wore consisted of Portuguese and French lizard ones, as pointed out by Savimbi himself in the previous clip we showed, not the in-game seen Rhodesian brushstroke ones. The UNITA soldiers in-game are wearing two kinds of headgear, first being plain bright red berets, which although did exist among UNITA forces in reality, should not be seen in this many numbers, especially worn entering a combat zone such as this, as it would provide little protection or even sun cover and would ruin the whole point of their camo uniform due to the beret's bright colour, so should instead be replaced by at least field caps or bush hats that they wore in reality in this case. And the second headgear being worn by them are American PASGT helmets, which had only just entered service with US troops in the mid-1980s. They should be replaced with helmets like the South African M63 as seen worn by the UNITA soldiers in this picture. A vast amount of the UNITA fighters and later seen Cuban soldiers are wearing sunglasses, despite this wide-scale wearing of them not being present in any historical photos of soldiers during the Angolan Civil War. The Hawk MM1 grenade launcher that Savimbi is wielding here was produced in extremely limited numbers in the 1970s and was never actually implemented into any armed force or any war including Angola. A potential replacement would be the Y2 Milker MGL Mark I, which was introduced and adopted by South Africa in 1983. Since South Africa was also involved during the war in Angola and supported UNITA, the appearance of the weapon among them would make sense. Additionally, when we get to use the grenade launcher later via choosing it in the customization menu, we can see that it features a capacity of 24 grenades, double that of the real 12. It also has no iron sights, with the screen simply zooming in when we hit the aim button, and its grenades are not affected by gravity, acting more like rockets. Although it is difficult to identify due to the quality of some of the images, a multitude of historical photographs show that Jonas Savimbi carried Smith & Wesson revolvers, sometimes with handle customizations, but in game he is equipped with just a regular Colt Python. It is also worth noting that Savimbi iconically often carried a cane, even when in the field, which is not seen throughout this mission.
Here they come! Here they come, my brothers! Fight, my brothers!
This massive scale Battle of Queen Province, as the wiki calls it, is fictional. However, the date setting of the mission does match up with an actual operation known as Southern Cross, which involved an artillery bombardment of the town of Coito Canavale conducted by the South African Defence Force, that occurred during July of 1986. This largely failed, however, and so led to their Operation Alpha Centauri, which involved a ground assault on the town the following month in an effort to prevent the People's Armed Forces for the Liberation of Angola, or FAPLA troops, which was the armed forces branch of the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, from reaching Jamba, the capital of UNITA. However, of course, the game's date is still 1 month off for this ground operation, and in the wrong location too. Thus, the mission should be changed to fit the criteria of Operation Alpha Centauri, or have its date setting moved a year forward, so that it would fit within the Angolan Civil War's biggest conflict, the Battle of Coito Canavale, along with South Africa's Operation Modular as a vital part of the battle. And on this point, the aforementioned operations, along with most other battles throughout the Angolan Civil War, had an involvement of South African forces, so it would be warranted to see an appearance or at least hear a mention of South African soldiers to go along with the South African Buffalo infantry mobility vehicles and Eland armoured cars that the UNITA fighters are using in-game. The MPLA's FAPLA forces are portrayed comedically badly in game, with all of them being depicted as wearing only undershirts at the beginning section like some sort of mad rebels. The MPLA were and still are today the government faction of Angola, who during this war saw the full support of both the Soviet Union and Cuba, and so should have quite better uniforms, including camo ones such as the Cuban grey lizard pattern, along with further weapons like some captured World War II era weapons supplied by the USSR, along with further vehicles such as BRDM-2s, BM-21 Grads, and BTR armoured personnel carriers. Every single one of the MPLA soldiers are wearing no headgear in game, as before they should mostly be wearing field caps, bush hats, or Soviet SSH helmets. Also, many of the soldiers are wielding just American M1942 machetes, which would be very unlikely for both sides. And the MPLA forces that do have guns, despite being trained by their allies including Cuba and Soviet advisors, with some also being veterans of their nation's previous war for independence in reality, are seen firing their weapons over their heads while running towards their targets. Even the fundamentals of this attack make no real sense. They should be using tanks or other vehicles as cover to approach the enemy, not just openly charging towards them. Like, at this point, this is just a downright insulting portrayal of an actual armed force. Both UNITA and MPLA soldiers have American M18 smoke grenades, which incorrectly have M83 written on them. The M83 smoke grenade was not even designed until the 1990s. Inside the UNITA forces' Buffalo trucks are US M29 mortar shells, which should instead be shells of the Soviet M37 82mm mortar that they had access to in reality. Every single one of the UNITA and MPLA soldiers are all attached with M1911s, which is largely misplaced and inaccurate, as most of the forces should not even have a sidearm in reality. The equipment of every one of the soldiers in this mission, including the later Cubans, is wrong too, as they are all wearing American all-purpose lightweight individual carrying equipment, or ALICE, with way too many compass/bandage pouches, as well as a NATO Stanek rifle mag pouch and loads of pistol mags in pouches, despite most of them wielding just AK and FN-FAL assault rifles in game. Also, as you may have noticed, pretty much the entirety of this gear, including the aforementioned M1911s, M18 smoke grenades, M29 mortars, M1942 machetes, PASGT helmets, and OG-107 uniforms are all American. However, with the exception of perhaps some of the Cuban forces who in reality had a surprising amount of it, all of these forces should absolutely not have this much US gear, especially the MPLA forces who we even go on to see having US Flak 55 jackets on the barrage. This is due to two main reasons. First being that such levels of such equipment is not seen in any historical photos taken during the conflict, and second being that although yes, the US did support UNITA, they had stopped sending them supplies as part of the Clark Amendment in 1976, and only then started sending military aid again in the mid to late 1980s. By 1986, however, all that was sent was mostly Stinger missiles, not massive loads of uniforms and weapons like we see in game. Not only should the aforementioned South African forces be operating these Buffalo infantry vehicles, but the trucks themselves are also shown having a completely enclosed roof, when in reality the majority of the combat scene Buffaloes had open roofs, with even the closed top versions having a latch and a different shape to the one seen in game. The UNITA rebels are using Soviet DSHK MGs here, when they should be using the Buffalo's actual usual main armament of either an M1919A4 or FN MAG MG. While the USSR-backed MPLA and later Cuban forces are seen using American M2HBs instead of their actually supplied Soviet MGs. Also, as we can clearly see here and when we get to use them ourselves in the later missions, the mounted M2HBs do not have any ammo feeding into them yet still somehow fire. Additionally, as is the case here with the DSHK, raising the FOV in the settings menu shows that our character does not have his hands on the mounted MGs at all, yet the trigger is still somehow operated. The FN FAL we start this mission with and see throughout the campaign is the same civilian G-series model from the original Black Ops. In the campaign, it defaults to firing fully automatically, which is incorrect since the G-series model is a civilian semi-auto only rifle. Also, this FN FAL, as well as many other weapons throughout the campaign, have ACOG sights, despite the fact that the first ACOG model, known as the TA-01, was not released until 1987. The model in question is the same Colt 3X scope from the first game. Plus, the ACOG name seems to be a blanket term for low-power scopes in this series. Its bare version incorrectly has a L1A1's hide foldable rear sights and fire selector. Its fire selector switch is set to semi-auto, yet we can still fire full auto. And speaking of fire selectors, some of the weapons have a fire selector as an attachment, despite the fact that fire selectors are not attachments, but are a core default part of almost all guns. And even when we do use it, the fire selector switch itself will not change position, despite the fire rate changing after performing the animation. The extended mags attachment gives each weapon an additional around 34% extra mag ammo capacity, but never actually changes the sizes of the magazine models, resulting in impossible amounts of ammo in mags. For example, extended mags on this FN FAL grants it 27 rounds within its 20 round mag. Also, this game makes the common mistake of referring to the magazines as clips. When we're loading the FN FAL, our character drops and disregards the entire mag onto the ground no matter how much ammo was left in it. Not only are armed forces taught to never do this, as it would waste valuable mags and ammo, but to do it this many times as we can in game would need Mason to carry like 200 full mags on him. Also, on the topic of having many mags, our character does actually hold an obscene amount of ammunition on him in addition to his often very heavy loadouts, including grenades, motor shells, flak vest, animal traps, swords, mines, machetes, and so on, all on top of his firearms, including machine guns and even anti-material rifles. We even sometimes see Mason pull out further equipment in addition to this, such as the high power he equips when meeting Menendez, and the Colt Model 604 we pull out when capturing Noriega, both regardless of if you were carrying one previously, or the big 40-pound cratering charge that he was apparently just casually carrying around during the Afghanistan mission. It goes without saying that much of this equipment being carried all at once would not be humanly possible.
Like almost all M203 grenade launchers in the COD series, there is no model for a spent casing, and so when reloading, an unfired grenade round is dumped out of the launcher.
Just like in the previous Treyarch COD games, the M1911 has a World War II A1 slide and trigger, but a Colt Series 80 frame and hammer, although these parts being together is possible as of the date setting of these missions. In game, every one of the M1911s all have this customization by default, which is not accurate. Most of them should just be regular M1911 A1s. Despite its slide moving, the hammer doesn't, remaining always static. Also, as evident with the M1911, this game's view models aren't the best, resulting in the proportions of many of the weapons to be off, often with them being oddly big, especially when compared with models from other Call of Duty games and to their actual size in reality. The MPLA and subsequent Cuban forces are seen using Browning high-power pistols. As aforementioned, most of them did not even have a sidearm in reality, but for those who did, it was Soviet pistols like the TT-33 and Makarov PM. Also, the high powers in-game by default have 10 round magazines instead of the correct 13 round mags. Although there is a real high power variant with a 10 round magazine, that being the 40 SAW version, this variant would be anachronistic for this time period, as the 40 SAW was not designed until 1990, and high powers chambered for it were not first marketed until 1994. The high powers hammer does not move or function. The AK-47 from the first Black Ops is seen again, being the same complete mess of a conglomerate model that features an AKS-74's receiver and magazine, an AKM's front sight and gas block, an AK-47 smooth handguard, a Type 2 AK-47's wooden stock with mounting bracket, a short charging handle from an AKS-74U, and a Type 3 AK-47's receiver mounted rear sling loop. Instead, there should be any proper AK variant, such as the AK Type 3 variant, which is the most widespread and popularly depicted in the media, or additionally the AKM for the entire Cold War section. Putting the select fire attachment on some of the weapons such as the AK and later Colt Model 604 makes them into burst fire despite it not being a feature of the actual guns. Some of the AKs have Russian PKAV red dot sights which were not developed until the 1990s and 2000s, while some others feature fictionalized Russian Cobra red dot sights, which is also anachronistic as these were not introduced until 1996. The GP30 grenade launcher is missing its quadrant sight, and the reload animation of the GP30 includes an incorrect flick of the launcher to eject a spent casing, despite the fact that its VOG grenades are built like mortar rounds and are ejected from the launcher in their entirety. In addition, the African combatants using massive amounts of several expensive weapon attachments in a place like this is quite absurd, including several ridiculous and colourful camo paints among the weapons. And these two same points also go for the later seen Mujahideen, Cartel, and PDF forces as well. When our character picks up a weapon, he always cocks it, regardless of if it needs to be or not, and no matter how many times we cock a weapon, no rounds are ever ejected. When we use the RPG-7, we see that our character does not load the proper propellant charges. He also never cocks the hammer, and the RPG-7 features backwards rear sights. The customization menu allows us to start this mission with a Beretta Model 682 shotgun, which the game incorrectly refers to as an Olympia. It also has a shorter barrel and only has 5 vents instead of 8. And when we have just 1 shell left in reserve, our character will still somehow load 2 shells, with the shotgun refusing to shoot the second imaginary shell as well. The loadout customization screen also lets us use an M134 minigun, which our character somehow manages to fire from the hip while moving, despite the weapon's immense recoil and weight. Not to mention that the minigun also seems to lack any power source to even make it function, let alone fire. And the last menu exclusive non-anachronistic weapon available to use is the ballistic knife, which did exist in reality but only had a range of about 5 meters, much shorter than the mad long range that the knives can be fired in game.
It is also worth mentioning that the menu allows us to put on perks, and some of them give us very exaggerated physical abilities, like putting the Fast Mags perk and attachment on, which allows us to reload at inhumanly fast speeds. While others give us straight up impossible abilities, such as Throwback, which resets grenade timers, and Ammo Pickup, which gives the enemies way too modern looking bags that spawn in when they die and just so happen to contain the correct ammo and grenades we have, which our character teleports into his inventory upon walking over them.
Mason can apparently cut off whole heads and 2 entire legs with 1 slash of a machete. We see him somehow do the same with the rusty old sword we find in a later Afghanistan mission, and even with the ballistic knife too. Some melee weapons do have the potential to cut through bone and even decapitate. However, to do so would not only require a tremendous amount of force, but the weapon itself would have to be a correct and a sharpened one in the hands of a trained user. The MPLA are seen putting the aforementioned American M29 mortar shells into German Kurzer 8cm Granatwerfer 42 mortars, but they should be using Soviet M43 120mm mortars that the MPLA were supplied with in reality. Hudson's Alouette 3 helicopter is armed with these strange looking MGs mounted off the side. In reality, it should be either door-mounted M1919s, a MAG machine gun, or a cabin-fitted 20mm MG151 cannon that existed on the actual Alouette 3 gunship versions. The helicopter is also equipped with rocket pods, which can somehow swivel and fire incredibly incorrect and absurdly way too large missiles.
Damn it, Hudson! They got T-62 tanks in support!
Like the aforementioned AKs, the T-62 tanks seen throughout this game are a strange hybrid model, featuring a T-62's barrel and rear, a T-55's turret, manlet, and slightly more forward road wheel, with elements of the tank also appearing to be based on a foreign copy such as the Chinese Type 69. Overall, for both this mission and the following Old Wounds level that they appear in, these hybrid tanks should be changed into proper T-62s, with perhaps some T-54/55s, and even maybe a rare few T-34s also making an appearance, as they did in both Angolan and Afghan wars in reality. Also, if this was not bad enough, when these T-62 hybrid tanks blow up, they for some reason magically transform into TO-55 flamethrower tank wrecks. Yes, you read it right. The free-to-play World War II first-person shooter of Enlisted has graciously sponsored this video to offer what I'd recommend as a way more fun and historically authentic experience than to whatever these other FPS games are doing nowadays.
Playtime is over when Nikki drops it.
Enlisted immerses you as a sniper, pilot, tanker, flametrooper, medic, or stormtrooper in iconic World War II campaigns, including battles such as Stalingrad, Normandy, Tunisia, Berlin, or their newly introduced Pacific campaign, in which dozens of vehicles and aircraft clash. You can customize your weapons, equipment, and characters while playing through Enlisted's vast destructible maps, or create and play through custom levels with the mission editor. So after finishing this video, give it a try by heading on into the description or pinned comment and clicking the channel's custom download link to get started with an exclusive bonus pack including soldiers, weapons, and more, with Enlisted available on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation, all for completely free.
Where?
The description and pinned comment. Now, back to the inaccuracies, or as we have dubbed them, the Black Oops. Kravchenko returns in this cutscene, still wearing his strange uniform, consisting of half-full military hardware and leather jacket with fictional shoulder boards.
6 months later, they shipped me over to Da Nang.
The Da Nang POW camp Woods is referring to here is one that was located deep in the jungle west of Da Nang, but the cutscene for whatever reason shows a map of Da Nang City, which was at the time still under the control of the American and Allied forces.
Lost 17 of my group. By 72, It was just me.
The West Da Nang prison camp was abandoned in 1971, when all of its remaining 14 POWs were forcibly marched out of the camp to head up to the Ho Chi Minh Trail to Hanoi, where they stayed until their release alongside all the other US POWs in North Vietnam in 1973, thus making Woods solely imprisoned in and escaping from the West Da Nang camp in 1972 impossible. This very camp even had a POW defect from it prior to 1971. Which would have made the game's story a lot more plausible if the devs did not decide to make Woods escape from it in 1972. This North Vietnamese soldier has a Colt Sporter competition / M16A4, which is both misplaced and anachronistic, as this version of M16 was not introduced until the 1990s. When escaping from his 4-year-long captivity, Woods is seen still wearing his US military attire, including a grenade belt, when he should be wearing prisoner clothes, like as seen in several historical photos of actual US POWs in North Vietnamese prison camps.
When approaching the transport barrage, a RPG rocket is fired at us, and is seen sharply changing its trajectory to hit our helicopter, which would be impossible in reality as the RPG is an unguided rocket launcher.
The ship we land on seems to have a fictional flag that is strangely similar to the flag for the Union of Progressive People from the Alien franchise. Some developer must have been having a laugh. The generic stripped-down fictional patrol boats being used by the Angolan Navy here should be the actual Soviet-supplied ones, such as Zoo-class patrol boats, or additionally even Portuguese boats captured after the Angolan War of Independence in the 1970s, such as Jupiter-class or Bellatrix-class patrol boats. In accordance with classic Hollywood fiction, we can apparently completely blow up these boats, as well as many other vehicles throughout the game with just regular bullets. Many of the enemy forces have the AKS-74U, which in-game is misreferred to as the AK-74U. In contrast with the actually used AKS-74Us, the ones in-game have a slightly longer barrel and gas tube, matte black handguard, steel magazine, and no stock. It incorrectly ejects pistol caliber cartridge casings, and even the AKS-74U's appearance in such high numbers among regular MPLA and Cuban foot soldiers is inaccurate. They should mostly be replaced by, say, the PPSH-41 instead. Many of the SMGs have the classic Call of Duty made-up gimmick attachment of rapid fire, which is depicted as a change of trigger, when in reality heavily increasing the fire rate of a weapon like this would need an alteration of its internals. The RPD features a MIL STD 1913 Piccadilly accessory rail, which did not exist until 1995. Its SCOP-0040 scope mount has been cut in half and a rail has been attached to the top cover. Its sights are misaligned. It is incorrectly depicted with a disintegrated bolt. Its belt does not correspond to the remaining ammo. When a foregrip is attached, it strangely switches the handguard of the RPG to one that appears to be based on that of the Romanian AMI AK clone. And finally, both the partial and empty reloads use the same animation. It is also noteworthy that the RPD sounds like a nerfed down BB gun in-game. This bad weapon sound design is also prevalent in many other weapons in this game. With many guns firing and reload sounds being reused from each other. Way too modern and futuristic looking ammo crates are seen being used not only by the Cuban/MPLA forces, but also by the later seen Mujahideen, Cartel, and Panamanian forces too. The rocket launcher that we shoot this hind down with is a fictional launcher based on the 9K34 Strela 3, aka SA-14 Gremlin. Also, when we fire it, we see that it runs out of fuel and momentum very fast, despite the fact that an SA-14 should have a range of around 2.5 miles.
What the hell? hell are Cubans doing here?
I find it incredibly unlikely that Mason, a CIA agent who has been sent in to fight in the Angolan Civil War, somehow does not know about the MPLA's mass Cuban military aid and direct intervention of hundreds of thousands of Cuban soldiers throughout the Angolan War, especially considering that Hudson literally even mentioned it to him earlier.
Castro and the Russians are all over Angola.
And to add to this, Mason seems to identify the soldiers as Cuban from them speaking Spanish, despite the fact that it's actually Angola's official language of Portuguese that is being spoken by the Cuban here, not Spanish.
They're just kids.
According to a report from the Human Rights Watch conducted after the Angolan Civil War, these types of soldiers were unfortunately used in both sides of the conflict, despite it being against the legislation of the MPLA government. Now, the details of their treatment during the war is really grim, so I will leave the report in the description if you wish to look into it yourself. However, this report does outline that the MPLA factions use minor soldiers in less numbers than the UNITA forces, who also seem to have been somewhat more so notorious for using and abusing these types of combatants. Yet the game portrays none of them in the UNITA units, instead portraying the fighters as a full camo uniform wearing, well-equipped and trained force who easily crushed their enemy quickly and mowed them down as they flee the battlefield, all triumphed under the lead of their charismatic leader Jonas Savimbi, who even swoops in and saves our characters at the end of the day, all despite Savimbi in reality being an extremely controversial figure. Comparing this then to how the game depicts the MPLA forces as ridiculously incompetent, under-equipped, under-trained prisoner of war and adolescent abusers, not to mention showing the Cuban soldiers involved in such abuse, which seems quite questionable, shows to me at least that at best this depiction is just a severe, naive outlook from Treyarch, or at worst there could be an argument that in some degree this is a purposeful, one-sided, biased portrayal of an actual lesser-known war, with devastating effects still haunt the people of Angola today. In a strange twist to this game's portrayal, however, despite the game's quite universally understood badass attempted depiction of Savimbi, the family of the actual late Jonas Savimbi sued Activision back in 2016 because they thought that the game portrayed him as a quote barbarian and a big half-wit who likes to kill everybody, despite some historians arguing that he was exactly that. But regardless, it was concluded that Savimbi's portrayal was within the laws of freedom of expression, and so the lawsuit was dropped. American NPCs in the past levels frequently have M34 white phosphorus grenades on their chest rigs. As in Black Ops 1, they are incorrectly shown painted green, which was not done in real life before the adoption of NATO Standing 2321 in 1987. Period M34 grenades should be white. Throughout these missions, we can find nearly all the enemy forces, as well as the Mujahideen in the Old Wounds mission, having these as aforementioned way too modern supply crates that now also just so happen to contain the exact loadout that our character was wielding throughout the mission, regardless of if the weapons are location or era accurate for them to have. We can find the SVD Dragunov in this mission, which as before is for some reason a hybrid weapon between a Dragunov and an AKS-74. All of the Dragunovs have black synthetic features instead of the wooden ones which were widely used during the Cold War. It completely lacks a flash hider. It also uses an inaccurate modern civilian variant POSP scope reticle rather than a period accurate PSO1. Its safety switch is always switched on, yet we still somehow fire. And the bolt should lock back once empty. The M67 grenade has a fuse of 4 to 5 seconds. However, when Menendez ignites one here, it does not explode for around 12 full seconds. Also, when the grenade does explode, despite it being covered by multiple people, it completely blows up the entire building's interior. We even go on to see later Woods using the same type of grenade on Menendez and his sister's room, which results in multiple stories of the building getting completely destroyed by it. Putting aside the question of how in the name of Jesus Menendez survived this, and this. The game's depiction of these grenade explosions in absolutely no way represents the actual explosive power of an M67 or any other such fragmentation grenade, which in reality looks like this.
Although they were worn to some degree in reality, too many of the Cuban soldiers are wearing Che Guevara-style black berets along with field caps that inaccurately have red stars on them. It should be at least mostly helmets or proper field caps like as shown here.
The Cuban soldiers have on them American M18 smoke grenades in black casings and Russian letters slapped on. In the entire Cold War section, pretty much all the enemy units are using fictional futuristic fragmentation grenades on us, consisting of these bizarre MK2 and M67 hybrids. The MPLA, Cuban and later Soviet forces should be using Soviet grenades, like the F1 and RGD-5, while the subsequent cartel and Panamanian forces should be using M67s as well.
As for stun grenades, our character is equipped with M84 stun grenades, which did not enter service until 1995.
It is also worth mentioning that even though our character is using 20th century era M67s and M84 grenades, the player HUD always incorrectly shows them as their made up futuristic versions. There exists no evidence of UNITA forces having or using MiL-Mi-24 helicopters during this time period. It is possible that they could have captured them from the enemy, but this seems quite unlikely, especially since Savimbi is using it still with its Red Star Soviet insignia on it. That is certainly one way to get shot down by your own friendly forces. I mean, Hudson himself even mistakes it as being an enemy helicopter when he first sees it.
Russians. Damn it. No way out.
All of the Hinds in-game feature a fixed side-mounted GSH-32, which was exclusive to the Mi-24P variant and was never used alongside the Yak-B 12.7mm nose machine gun as incorrectly portrayed in-game. Also, all of the MiL-Mi-24 Hinds that were supplied to the National Air Force of Angola were finished in a more bright and sharply democrated yellow and dark brown camouflage, attached with the standard Angolan roundel. It is also important to note that the Angolan and Cuban air forces around this time used multiple other aircraft in Angola that the game fails to show, such as Mi-8/17 helicopters, fighters such as MiG-17s, MiG-21s, and MiG-23s, along with several cargo planes including Kaza C-212s. Tactically speaking, these attack aircraft would have made perfect sense to have been used against the UNITA forces in this mission's opening battle, instead of the massive, ridiculous ground force charge that they do in game.
As a boy, he witnessed the country's rape and murder his people.
Menendez was born in 1963, meaning his childhood would have been spent in the late 60s to mid-70s. The US-backed Contras, however, did not begin operating until 1979, meaning that Menendez would have, at the bare minimum, been 16 years old by the time he would have been able to first experience the Contras' crimes. We even get further confirmation of this inaccuracy when straight away after this we are told,
In 1972, there was a colossal earthquake. His family lost everything.
indicating that the Contras existed before 1972, which is incorrect. The revolver Menendez is seen using in this cutscene is not an actual firearm, but instead a Brunei Olympic 6 blank firing revolver, used most commonly to start a track and field sprint.
Right, so now Menendez fucking hated America and started running guns in Afghanistan for his own private army.
It would be impossible for Menendez to smuggle these British L-85A2s into Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War, as the weapon was not even introduced until the 2000s. Also, while discussing the Soviet war in Afghanistan and the First Cold War as Salazar calls it, the cutscene rather inappropriately shows modern post-Cold War footage of US soldiers accompanied by Humvees, which were not first used in such a desert environment until the Gulf War in the 1990s.
CIA got wind of it, went on the hunt for him in Kabul. That was the photo Wood showed us in the vault, remember?
Despite that cutscene just showing a map of and telling us that this mission takes place in Kabul, when we load in it tells us that we are in the province of Khost, a completely different part of Afghanistan. And in contrast to all this, the start of the level then shows us the famous Buddhas of Bangyang structures, which were located in the province of Bangyang, not Khost nor Kabul. Also, the surrounding area of the real Bangyang Buddhas didn't exist in the manner seen in-game.
What'd you see, Woods?
Sand and more fucking sand.
Strange of you to say, Woods, considering that most regions in Coast are covered by grass and trees. Even the most rural areas still have a relative amount of vegetation, unlike the full-blown desert we see in game.
I will take you to the leader of the Mujahideen.
The Mujahideen did not necessarily have one overall leader, but more so multiple more localized leaders. The one we meet in game is also fictional, which seems almost strange considering how Treyarch went out of their way to include real leaders such as Savimbi and later Noriega throughout the rest of these Cold War era missions. In reality, the Mujahideen forces in Coast around this time would likely be under the leadership of a figure such as Jalaluddin Haqqani, who led the Afghan rebels in Coast during the 1986 Second Battle of Zawar. The portrayal of the Mujahideen's uniforms seem to be off and partly fictional. The majority of their uniforms should be made in proper Salzwa kameez styles, with or without load-bearing vests, also mixed with others like some proper captured Soviet military clothing. Despite Coast being almost exclusively Pashtun, the Mujahideen speak Iranian Farsi in-game instead of Pashto. In addition to their American M2HBs and M29 motor shells, the US M26 and Mark III hand grenades, along with the Belgian M72 grenades that the Mujahideen have, should mostly be replaced by more appropriate captured Soviet ones.
The Russian assault has begun. Yalla! Yalla, Boromirun!
This big Battle of Coast, as stated by the wiki, is fictional. Even the logistics behind such a large-scale solely Soviet attack makes no real sense. By this stage of 1986, the USSR was in quite terrible shape, and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev had already announced the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan. Even assaults that occurred in Coast around this time, such as the Second Battle of Zawar, saw the Soviets providing a supportive role while letting their ally, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, to take main charge. And speaking of which, the Coast province was considered the most loyal to the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's government, with most members of their military and the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan being from Coast, including their president Najibullah, so the game not including any of their soldiers makes zero sense. While on horseback, all weapons are reloaded off-screen, and most of them are held with one hand. However, with this game's logic going against all known well-documented military and historical sources, weapons that are normally reloaded with each round individually will be loaded completely at once. The combat axe can be thrown off with no visible hand. There is no visible hand pulling the grenade's pins. If the player selects an assault rifle under-barrel grenade launcher, Mason will hold the rifle with one hand and can fire the launcher without pulling its trigger. The RPG-7 appears to have a loaded round in it still after firing. Holding weapons that require two hands, such as the ballistic knife, completely remove the reins, yet we are still able to control the horse fine somehow. And to top it all off, while on the horse, not only can we effectively operate many heavy and high recoil weapons with one hand, including machine guns, rocket launchers, and an anti-material rifle, but we can even fire a levitating minigun on horseback. The only Soviet fighter jets we see used in-game are these way too many MiG-23s. However, an estimate of Soviet aircraft in Afghanistan in 1986 shows that jets such as MiG-21s and Su-17s were much more common, along with some Su-25s also being there in decent numbers too. The Soviet uniforms in-game are really off and partly fictional, with them wearing the aforementioned American equipment with the strange pouch arrangements, Flask with US M81 woodland camo, and American M18 smoke grenades. They should be proper Afghanka uniforms, such as the two most common kits in Afghanistan, the H/B and Afghanka. Some of them could also wear the KLMK pattern in limited numbers. It could also be regular army mixed with VDV, plus not every Afghanka at the time was khaki, some were also olive.
The Soviet soldiers, along with pretty much every other soldier seen throughout these missions, are all wearing the same generic jungle boots. It is worth mentioning that if Treyarch wanted to portray the Soviet troops as Spetsnaz special forces like they usually do, then since the USSR at the time did not have any good mountain shoes for special forces, they had to wear ordinary civilian sneakers, since they were much more comfortable than boots, as seen worn by the GRU special forces in this picture. Despite being sent into an active combat zone, all of the Soviet troops are wearing only field caps, when they should be having much more variation among their headgear, including helmets, hoods, face masks, etc. The Makarov PM in this game is still using the old model from Black Ops 1, with the adjustable rear sight that is only available with the civilian Baikal IJ-70 version, not used until the 1990s. Its hammer also does not move or function, and its windowed mag is completely static and does not correspond to the ammo remaining in the magazine. The Soviet troops use loads of so-called AK-47s, despite the fact that old AK variants had been phased out of frontline service by this time, being replaced by the AK-74. A few of the AK-74s could also be seen used by the Mujahideen as captured weapons. A similar point goes to the RPD among the Soviet forces, which would have been replaced by the RPK-74 and PKM at this point. The AKS-74U is incorrectly shown used by frontline Soviet troops, whereas in reality it was only issued to tank crews, special forces and support units. The real Mujahideen fighters had various kinds of weapons in use, notably those from World War II and older eras, particularly the Soviet and British ones. Heck, they even had M16 and G3 rifles in use as seen in these pictures, along with weapons captured from the Soviets. For some reason, the Mujahideen used the M1911 as their only sidearm, while the commonly used ones in reality were Soviet pistols. The BTR-60 was at first used during the start of the Soviet-Afghan War in the early 1980s. However, factors such as its engine often failing in the hot Afghanistan sun and its turret not being able to aim high up enough to fire at Mujahideen fighters on high ground made it so that it was quickly replaced by the newer BTR-70s. Yet in game, we only see BTR-60s, with no BTR-70s or BMPs making an appearance. This mine box is labeled as containing American-made M1 mines, but actually contains Italian VIS 1.6 anti-tank mines. Realistically, they should be replaced by Soviet ones, such as the PMN. When planting them, Mason simply tosses the VIS 1.6 anti-tank mines onto the ground, without correctly burying them, so that they can be concealed and get driven over properly. The mines can also be exploded by riding a horse by it or just walking on it, which is impossible in reality, as the VIS 1.6 anti-tank mine would need at least 180 kgs of direct pressure on it to explode. As of this mission's date setting, the first US Stinger missiles had only just started being sent to the Mujahideen, with the first Hind being destroyed by a Mujahideen-used Stinger being on September 25, 1986, 20 days after this level's date. For some god knows what reason, the FIM-92 Stinger in this game was butchered by inaccurately portraying it as a dual-mode anti-tank and anti-aircraft missile launcher. It also has a RPG-7's iron sights placed on its folding sight. And in addition, its missiles can be detonated prematurely to literally rain fire on the enemies. In reality, Stingers are meant to target aircraft. It's highly unlikely that a Stinger would be able to disable a T-62, as Stingers aren't designed to penetrate tank armor.
Infantry fast roping in!
There exists no evidence of Soviet forces fast roping, especially to the amount we see in game during the Soviet-Afghan War, as it was at the time a relatively new technique, first developed by British forces during the Falklands War in 1982. Also, it would typically be experienced special forces who would fast rope rather than rappel into battle, not standard infantry. This absolute monstrosity seems to be a weirdly modeled T-64 and might be combined with inspirations from some Soviet prototype projects with dual gun systems, including those that existed but only in blueprints.
Russians want to give us one last display of brute force. Let's give them one last display of courage. You with me?
Ah yes, charging right towards the enemy's fictional prototype tank, along with escorting armored vehicles, helicopters and jets on horseback, is the smartest thing that one CIA agent and our allied NPCs, including die-hard veterans like Woods and Zhao, is to do in this situation. Not to mention the Afghan rebels somehow understanding and agreeing to this charade, when most of them should not even understand Mason's English. One last display of courage, more like one last pathetic little stunt of the imbeciles. Kravchenko returns again, this time for some reason leading Soviet troops in Afghanistan. His weird half-military uniform has been replaced now, but with an equally inaccurate one, featuring American Alice equipment. Since he is a part of a tank crew here, he should be wearing an appropriate tanker uniform, including at least a TSH-4 helmet. As demonstrated when we were using them earlier, mortar shells explode on impact, yet the one we throw into this tank kinda just chills in there and waits a solid 3 seconds for Mason to jump off the tank before exploding. The karambit knife Woods uses during Kravchenko's interrogation is based on the Emerson karambit fixed blade, which makes it heavily anachronistic, as Emerson knives was not founded until 1996.
He's being offered up on a silver platter by old pineapple face himself, Manuel Noriega. One of the perks of being the president of Panama is that you get to use the army as your own private police force. So, CIA, in their infinite wisdom, they sign off on the deal. The White House, they cut a check for $1 million and everybody takes a victory lap. And off we go to the jungle.
This whole mission, including the joint operation between the Panama Defense Force or PDF and the CIA in Nicaragua, along with Menendez and his cartel, are just complete fiction to serve the game's story. It would be much more accurate if Treyarch chose to do something similar to the previous 2 levels, where our US forces would collaborate with their ally, the Contra rebels, to fight against the Sandinista National Liberation Front or FSLN during the Nicaraguan Revolution. The Nicaraguan FSLN government were socialist allies with nations such as the USSR and Cuba, so it would even make sense for Menendez and his cartel to be seen allied with them, like how it was with the Cubans in Angola and Soviets via Kravchenko. And speaking of the FSLN, despite this entire mission taking place in Nicaragua, we see not one soldier or even hear any mention of the Nicaraguan FSLN armed forces throughout this level, not even to investigate after the massive battle took place. By the 1980s, the Nicaraguan armed forces had grown to become the largest and best equipped military in all of Central America. The government also had terrible relations with the US at the time, due to them supporting their enemy, the Contra rebels, so they certainly had the capabilities and warrant to get involved, making their complete lack of appearance and mention throughout this level really not match up. This level takes place in Huazaking, which is an actual village in Nicaragua. However, satellite images, photos, and even some videos of the real place show that it looks a lot different from what we see in game, with it being a lot flatter, not being as built up, and lacking many of the structures featured in game, such as the big cathedral and villa. The in-game version is also missing the entire second half of the village located across the Bambama River. Overall, it seems as though that this is just a fictional town that Treyarch made up and slapped the name Huazaking onto to try give it some real world credibility.
I told you he would be here.
The actual Panamanian military ruler Manuel Noriega spoke poor English, with him usually having to use interpreters to translate everything into Spanish when being interviewed by English speakers, and so it does not make sense to hear him speak English so fluently, especially when talking to fellow Spanish-speaking characters such as Menendez here.
No witnesses.
Woods is now, for some reason, wearing a Soviet-Afghan shirt. The real Panama Defense Force soldiers largely wore uniforms with camouflage patterns on them, particularly the modified versions of the American M81 Woodland camo pattern, but we see none of them appear at all in game. As for the original khaki uniforms in the game, that could be based on the earlier versions or are just fictional ones. Although the Panamanian forces did have non-camo uniforms in real life, especially for the military police, mechanized troops, and other garrison units, the colors are obviously not just only tan and khaki shades that are used for certain t-shirts and field caps for Pacific units, like the ones worn by the 6th Expeditionary / Mechanized Infantry Company as shown here. And as for their equipment, in-game it is once again US Alice, still with the nonsensical pouch arrangements. They should mostly be replaced by the older M1967 modernized load carrying equipment that they wore in reality. Although their red berets could be based on or inspired by ones worn by the real PDF units, such as Battalion 2000 and 3rd Infantry Company, they have no proper insignia patches on them at all, and also should not realistically be worn during a combat invasion, for the same reasons as the earlier UNITA soldiers. And mentioning of which, pretty much every nationality of soldiers seen throughout all these missions completely lack any rank insignia, even for high-ranking members such as Noriega. As is to be expected when researching niche topics such as this, there exists very limited info. However, from what we've been able to gather, the game's appearance of the PDF insignia on their left arm is either fictional or not widespread. The proper ones should look like what is seen on screen now. Many of the PDF soldiers throughout the game have machetes on their backs, which is certainly questionable, considering that no historical photos or sources show this. Some of the PDF soldiers seem to have modified Cry JPC plate carriers, which weren't adopted until the RBA and T/G Faust by US Special Forces in the late 1980s and early 90s. From all the points we have mentioned, we assume the PDF units in both Time and Fate and Suffer With Me missions are likely to be fictional, as to cover up the lack of historical information that is hard to find, and combined with a short period of time for the game developers, which is understandable. Nevertheless, with our further research, our suggestion for PDF units in this Time and Fate mission is just the aforementioned Battalion 2000. Alternatively, we could also include the Unidad S Special Anti-Terror or UESAT unit as an optional choice as well. Even though they are from Panama, the PDF soldiers speak Spanish in a similar way to the Venezuelan or Cuban accent. The SPAS-12 being used by Menendez somehow has a capacity of 16 shells instead of the limited 8. And if he fires 4 shells or more, he can somehow reload by dropping the entire gun and quickly pulling out a new fully loaded one out of nowhere. That or he is somehow reloading within 1 second. When Mason gets to use the SPAS-12, we see that it functions in semi-auto mode, with the forend in its proper forward position, but the player character will always incorrectly rack it at the end of a reload. This is impossible in reality, since the forend is locked into position when the weapon is set to semi-auto mode. Additionally, our character does not hold down the carrier latch when reloading the shells. The weapon stock is unfolded in the menu image, absent in the view model, and folded on the world model. The long barrel attachment on the SPAS-12 and many other weapons in this game does not actually change the length of the barrel at all. And the fast mags attachment allows us to somehow load 2 shells at once, despite our character clearly loading 1 shell at a time. Like in several first-person shooter video games, in contrast with the actual capabilities of the weapons, the SPAS-12 and every other shotgun in this game have a pitiful projectile range and often need more than 1 shot to kill enemies even at a close to medium range. Also, the large amount of SPAS-12s being used by the PDF soldiers in both Time and Fate and Suffer With Me missions does not match up, considering that roughly around 37,000 were ever built in reality, and there is no evidence that this faction had ever used this gun during this time. The more appropriate choice for regular PDF soldiers, and later the Dignity Battalion in Suffer With Me, would be the old versions of the Remington M870 with folding stock, and same goes to those among the cartel members. The default loadout starts us with a Barrett M107, which is incorrectly referred to as an M82A1 in-game. The gun is also anachronistic, since the M107 was not adopted until 2002. Even the earlier M82 version would still not be era accurate, since it did not enter service until 1989. It is erroneously modeled with ejection ports on both sides of the receiver. We also begin with a Galil ARM, which uses the handguards from an AR variant. It lacks its underside cutout for the bipod, its carry handle hinge is on the wrong side, and incorrectly uses a flip-up tritium sights instead of the flip peep sights. There is an assumption that Galils are known to be used by the aforementioned UESAT unit only, so it is inaccurate for the weapon to appear among regular PDF forces. This level's default loadout also gives us these fictional futuristic smoke grenades, which should be replaced by the game's already existent M18 or M34 smoke grenades. Additionally, our character never actually pulls the pins on these smoke grenades, yet they still somehow function. Despite having M1911s on them, the PDF soldiers only spawn in high-power pistols when they enter Last Stand mode. In reality, the PDF were also known to have other kinds of pistols like the M1911 in use as well, so it would make perfect sense to see them actually use it. The large amount of MP5s among the PDF is very questionable. It should be decreased or removed by being replaced with Uzis. The MP5A3's fire selector is of the wrong type for an SEF trigger group and is pointed in completely the wrong direction. Also, reloading it shows the top of its magazine to be completely solid with no visible ammo in it. The Uzis in-game incorrectly fire from a closed bolt instead of an open one. The Uzi is also quite clearly based on a civilian non-NFA weapon since it has the word semi-auto printed on the receiver. The PDF did not use the AKS-74U or any other type of AK-74 variant in reality. This fresh new M60E3 just introduced in 1986 among the PDF forces should be the older versions instead, or even FN Mag MGs, which were also a standard issue machine gun among Panamanian forces along with the M60. Like it was in the original Black Ops, the M60E3's tri-battle sights are backwards. It has an airsoft matrix aluminum duckbill flash hider. The weapon lacks its foregrip, with the ammo belt also not corresponding to the ammo remaining. The mounted RPDs with their bipods that are apparently just magically glued on to hold them up all have 100 round mags attached, yet are able to shoot indefinitely without even having a cooldown animation. This inaccuracy also applies to all the other mounted MGs too. The cartel are for some reason seen having loads of Somalian 50 shilling notes, which were not even first issued until 1991. In the background is a US MH-6 Little Bird helicopter. The US 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment did have MH-6s based in Palmarola Air Base, Honduras, which flew missions into the country during the Nicaraguan Revolution in the 1980s to support the Contras. However, their operators wore civilian clothes, flew by night, and were instructed to destroy their aircraft if they were forced down to the ground to conceal US involvement in Nicaragua, so them being flown through hostile airspace in broad daylight is both irresponsible and inaccurate. Not to mention that their airbase of Palmarola is located over 220 miles away from this village, so how it even got out here this far does not really match up. Alternatively, it could be the game showing the PDF forces using the MH-6, which is also inaccurate as the Panamanian Air Force in reality used helicopters such as the Huey.
I was pretty sure we got him in Nicaragua. About a year later, he shows up in Panama with that piece of shit Noriega. That's the last straw for the CIA. The orders come down from George H.W. for a snatch and grab. So your dad and I, we go in.
The last straw that led to the US invasion of Panama, codenamed Operation Just Cause, was obviously not the meeting between Noriega and the fictional Menendez. In reality, it was likely the death of US Marine First Lieutenant Robert Paz, who was mortally injured by the hands of PDF troops on December 16, 1989. Additionally, the game does actually very briefly show a newspaper mentioning First Lieutenant Robert Paz, but incorrectly refers to him as a second lieutenant. All the Humvees are reused assets from the previous Modern Warfare games, and so do not match up with the early versions that first saw combat during the invasion of Panama. If not altered, then the ones driven by Woods and Mason here should be the older M151 Jeeps instead.
Manuel Noriega, hereforth known as Objective False Prophet. It's a standard grab and smear operation.
The operation to capture Manuel Noriega was called Nifty Package, not False Prophet.
The invasion will draw attention away as we go in with Navy SEALs.
The actual Operation Nifty Package to capture Noriega was conducted solely by Navy SEALs operators. The involvement of the CIA directly in the field is very unlikely, especially during the subsequent assault on the airport. The MH-6 Little Bird is the only helicopter seen used throughout this mission. However, in reality, other helicopters such as the AH-64A Apache were also used, having been first introduced during this conflict and actually being used against the PDF resistance in the La Comandancia sector. Also, the MH-6s are often seen flying way too low to the ground, well within firing distance from the enemy ground forces. And they are all apparently remote controlled since none of them have any visible pilots. The Colt Model 604 we begin with is misreferred to as the Colt M16A1 in-game. It also lacks both a birdcage flash hider and a forward assist. By default, the weapon has 30 rounds somehow within its 20-round mag models. It features a static mag release. The weapon is fitted with a 1975 vintage Aimpoint Mark II, aka Aimpoint Electronic, though the text on the optic incorrectly refers to it as an Armpoint sight. And removing the sight shows that its rear sight is not enclosed by the sight protector as it should be. The only cargo vehicle the PDF are seen using are these many Soviet Gaz-66 trucks, which in reality should be American trucks such as the M35, or perhaps even some of the 32 East German Rober all-wheel drive trucks that the PDF had confiscated from a Danish cargo ship in 1986. The Panamanian forces, for some reason, have these fictional decoy grenades that dispense smoke, fire bullets all over the shop, and are activated by our character pulling a non-existent grenade pin off them. The only US jets we see in-game are these outdated F-4 Phantoms, which were never used during the Panama Invasion. They should instead be jets such as the F-117A alongside EF-111As, which were actually first fielded during Operation Just Cause. The real version of Punta Pailla airfield where the SEALs destroyed Noriega's jet in reality is not located in the El Chorrillo sub-district, but as the name suggests, a neighborhood of Punta Pailla within the city center, which is known to heavily feature the high-rise buildings that the base game tried to shoehorn here in the first place. The real hangar with Noriega's private jet and a ramp where the SEALs ambushed are located much further away from the shore than depicted in-game. In reality, 4 SEALs were killed during the Battle of Paitilla Airport as part of Operation Nifty Package, yet the game portrays the SEALs of Task Force White as absolute ghouls, with well more than 4 of them getting killed. As a matter of fact, a total of 23 US soldiers were killed in action throughout the entirety of Operation Just Cause, not matching up with the exaggerated death rate we see here, as well as throughout the other parts of the city we fight through in this mission. Punta Paitilla Airport had multiple different types of domestic airlines and small planes stationed there during the time of the battle. Yet in-game, the only aircraft we see are these civilian Cessna 170s, which also seem to have their vertical stabilizers fixed too high on the tail, as seen when compared to the actual aircraft. Despite both nations being Spanish-speaking, pretty much all the labels and signs seen throughout both this Panama mission and the previous Nicaragua level are all in English.
Noriega's plane is fucking ready to go! What? Hit him with an RPG!
During the Battle of Paitilla Airport, it was not an RPG, but instead an AT-4 that the Navy SEALs used to disable Noriega's jet. Plus, as seen in pictures of it, the jet's destruction in reality wasn't nearly as large and explosive as depicted in the game. And although it looks similar enough to Noriega's actual private jet destroyed at the airport, the aircraft we destroy in-game here is not directly based on it and is just a fictional model, with it for some reason having its engines under its wings mere centimeters off the ground, rather than on the tail as you would usually expect on such an aircraft. All of this mission sequences with Noriega are just fictional to serve the game's plot, and to be honest, the actual story leading up to his arrest is way more crazy and entertaining. In reality, at the start of the Panama Invasion, Noriega was out clubbing and getting languid and busy with a prostitute that he had sent one of his generals to retrieve, in a recreation center just east of Tocumen Airfield. When the AC-130 strikes began and 1st Ranger Battalion started landing at the airfield, he quickly fled the scene in a Hyundai wearing a t-shirt, boxers and flip-flops before hiding in his secretary's apartment in Panama City, so not some hotel. A few days later, he then took refuge in the Holy Seas, aka Vatican City Embassy. US forces, prevented by treaty from invading the embassy, then surrounded the building and used psychological warfare to get Noriega to surrender, including loudly playing rock and metal music to demoralize him, while getting a huge support, although troublesome, from the anti-Noriega protesters that began to surround the place when they heard the news of his hiding. Noriega would then eventually surrender to US forces 10 days later on January 3rd, 1990. He was not apprehended beforehand or took part in any prisoner exchange or any other of these made-up story points present in this mission. I also find it funny how the game stresses our characters trying to ruin his name by planting drugs and other contraband in his room.
Hey, what are you doing?
Sealing your reputation.
But by the time of the invasion, this man's reputation was already in bits, being a drug trafficker and brutal dictator, or maximum leader as he called himself. I mean, he somehow managed to start this invasion with a hooker and ended it jamming to American rock music surrounded by nuns and priests while having his own citizens bully him outside. To give you an idea of what type of person Noriega was, upon raiding his residence at Fort Amador, US forces found pictures of the Führer, an extensive hardcore adult magazine collection, a witch's diary noting visits by 2 voodoo priestesses from Brazil, and 50 kilograms of white powder which was later identified as flour. At Noriega's home at Altos de Golfo, they found 8 million in US currency and 2 religious altars, one of which was decorated with jars containing human internal organs. Like, what in the actual As for this Suffer With Me mission, the fictional PDF unit in the base game should be replaced with the following. First, for the airfield, due to extremely limited info, all we know is in 1979 to 1989, Albrook Army Airfield's hangar housed primarily the unknown Panama Defense Forces Engineer Battalion, so it is possible that a similar unit like this could be suitable for those defending the Puta Paitilla airfield as well. Additionally, another source suggests that the men in the hangar, far from being rent-a-cops, were highly trained PDF special operators. As for the city section, we believe that the protagonist and Noriega should travel towards the further southwestern sector of the city in order to reach their friendly troops of Task Force Bayonet. The closest heavy fighting among the area during the invasion would be the 3 hours of fighting at the PDF headquarters, also known as Commandancia, near Ancon Hill, that inflicted heavy damage damages towards El Chorrillo district that features in-game. Although the majority of the aforementioned 6th Expeditionary Mechanized Infantry Company and also 7th Moche de Monte Infantry Company would be stationed at Rio Hato, the elements of both units and elements of the 8th Military Police Company would be defending the Comandancia. And as for the last section, which features the historical site known as Miraflores Locks, it can be any unit really, but our suggestion is either an element of the aforementioned 6th Mechanized or 7th Infantry Company, which was known for being loyal to Noriega. Here we meet members of the Battalion Dignidad or Dignity Battalions, which were paramilitary militia units created by Noriega prior to the US invasion. However, in-game they are shown all wearing Alice equipment, despite historical pictures largely showing them not having any load-carrying equipment at all. Many of the Dignity Battalion fighters and earlier Menendez cartel members are seen for some reason having nightsticks and revolvers with no triggers on them. In reality, the Dignity Battalions and PDF units were known to have M16s and Taiwanese T-65s as service weapons as well, although largely phased out by the AKs during the time of the US invasion in December 1989, but were still known to exist even after the demilitarization of Panama when the US controlled the country and later on. Nevertheless, in the base game, they only used the AK hybrids as their main assault rifle, even in the previous Time and Fate mission that was set in 1986. Being the armed militia largely composed of civilian volunteers, the Dignity Battalions also used old American weapons, such as the M1 Garand and M2 Carbine, none of which appear in-game. Historical photographs and sources show the Dignity Battalions having female members, but we see none of them in this mission. And photos also show that an overall detail on the red cap with insignia they wore in-game does not match up with the ones in real life. In 1985, the United States military adopted the Beretta M9 to replace the M1911 as their standard issue service pistol. Yet in-game, we see no Beretta M9s throughout any of these late 1980s levels. Although sharing similarities with it, the camo pattern being worn by the American soldiers doesn't look like a proper M81 woodland camo pattern to us. Almost every US soldier, including special forces, haven't shaved their beards for no particular reason, in contrast to several historical photographs of the actual troops during the battle. Although they definitely existed, way too many of the US soldiers have Spanish surnames for some reason. At this point, the majority of the main assault rifles for the US soldiers should be the M16A2, with perhaps still a few of the older M16A1s among them as well. But in game, the only one we see them having is the Colt Model 604. There are certain mistakes on the American equipment. The buckle systems and pouch design on the vests are too modern. They didn't go to that style until the C standard. Every single buckle is loose on top of not being properly taped down to reduce noise, especially from their Velcro pouches. Also, the pouch should have M81 camo pattern or OD color rather than tan or khaki. Not to mention that despite them having pouches for 30 round mags, which were already the standard type of magazines for US soldiers at that time, the game still depicts them using the older M16 20 round magazines. There's quite a lack of weapon variation among the US soldiers, which is in contrast with reality and could be solved by adding some of the earlier designs of the M249 Minimi and optionally any proper CAR-15 variant. The SDU-5/E marker distress light in-game is given the wrong color. In reality, it is red. Also in-game, we use the SDU-5/E to call in AC-130 close airstrikes by throwing them at the enemy positions, which was not the intended use of it at all. In reality, the SDU-5/E was a distress light used to mark the position of ground forces to friendly overhead planes, usually so that they can get extracted. It is also worth noting that even when used in many combat situations, the strobe would be removed
from the device and placed inside the barrel of a grenade launcher, such as the M79, so that only those at the end of the barrel would see the flash, thus preventing enemies from seeing the exact position of the team.
This place is a fucking mess!
It wasn't much better before the raid.
Like the hotel, build and location of the airport, overall layout of the city, and multiple other structures seen throughout this mission, this abandoned looking hospital seems to just be fictional, not to mention how it is way too run down and dirty to still be in operation, with medical staff apparently still working within it somehow. The Barrett M107 that Woods pulls out here is modeled with a standard scope, but erroneously acts as a variable zoom scope. In one of the most important parts of this whole game, shooting this feckin' 50 caliber anti-material rifle at Mason simply results in him keeling over with no visible bullet wound, and depending on where you shoot, needing more than one bullet to incapacitate. I mean, come on game, where are the physics? In reality, a rifle such as this would have a high chance of completely blowing the victim's head into pieces, or causing their legs and other limbs to be torn off. And this problem also happens when we use the gun in the Time and Fate mission as well. The more appropriate choice to keep our favorite number obsessed character to survive would be to change this M107 into any kind of sniper rifle with a smaller caliber instead. Our personal choice would be the Dragunov, since it was used by the PDF in reality. Also, this particular M107 does not have any scope sway, with its bullets along with the ones from all the other sniper rifles in this game having pretty much no gravitational drop off and not being affected by wind at all. Feel free to deduct this inaccuracy at the final tally if you feel it is unnecessary. However, we believe that it is quite strange that the game does not at all explain to us what happened after the real life events we played through, such as UNITA losing the Angolan Civil War after Jonas Savimbi's assassination in 2002, the Soviets fully withdrawing from Afghanistan in 1989, or the US victory in Panama with Manuel Noriega's surrender and arrest in January 1990. And speaking of Noriega, like in Savimbi's case, the actual Manuel Noriega also tried to sue Activision back in 2014 when he was still in prison for them portraying him in this game. Yes, they were literally sued twice for these portrayals, but also like in the Savimbi case, it was dismissed due to the portrayal being protected under free speech laws. Surprisingly enough, most of the weapons in this game's year 2025 setting are actually based on real modern ones. So although we cannot look at the events or much anything else of the futuristic campaign, since there is nothing factual or historical about it, given that current events hopefully do not change that in the coming years. But regardless, we can continue to analyze the campaign by taking a look at just the weapons with information gathered in cooperation with weapon researcher Munancho Inc. Firstly, all of these modern and futuristic weapons can be used in the 1980s era levels by selecting them before starting the mission in the loadout menu, which is obviously very anachronistic. The FN-57's mag lacks feed lips. Also, the magazines themselves seem to be based on airsoft ones. The FN-FNP-45 Tactical by default incorrectly holds 10 rounds instead of 15. The TDI card should not fire in full auto, nor have an exterior hammer. The fire selector and bizarrely the bolt release are from a TDI vector. In game, the TDI card is called a Cap 40, implying it being chambered for the .40 Smith & Wesson. However, the weapon's markings display its chambering as .45 ACP. The gun also appears to be using Glock magazines, which would make the 10-round capacity incorrect. Our character never inserts any rounds into the cylinder of the Tyrus Raging Judge 27. Also, when reloading, the player character ejects the entire contents of the cylinder, but only inserts as many rounds as would be needed to replace those actually fired. In-game, it is fully compatible with a suppressor, despite the fact that the Judge, like most revolvers, does not have a gas-tight seal between the chamber and the barrel, and so would make a suppressor null and void.
Like what the aforementioned MPLA and Panamanian forces did when equipping the high power despite having M1911s on them, some of the friendly forces in the 2025 campaign have a Beretta 92 SB in their holsters, while the mercenary enemy soldiers carry a USP 45. However, all factions refuse to actually use them, choosing instead to just simply spawn a different pistol into existence when they need to use it. The Fast Mags attachment on the Kel-Tec KSG allows our character to load 2 shells into the shotgun at once, despite the KSG only having the capacity to load 1 shell at a time. Pulling the tube selector in the middle position blocks both magazine tubes from loading and feeding. The default reload animation would have our character load in all 14 shells into a single tube. Our character always pumps the shotgun regardless of if there is already a round in the chamber. And we load in green shells but eject red shell casings. The S12 is a Lone Star Arms Saiga 12 Sign Cutter VLRCS with an incorrect left hand ejection, enormous standoff door breaching muzzle brake, a side mounted scope bracket, and Heckler and Koch iron sights. Our character also locks back the charging handle and releases it after charging the magazine, which can only be done on later Saiga models. Despite being called so in-game, this shotgun is not actually a Remington 870 MCS, with it lacking the modularity features from the MCS and its forearm. It is instead a regular Remington 870 with an M4 stock, Surefire weapon light forend, RIS mount, and aftermarket ghost ring sights. Our character, for some reason, refuses to use the additional shells on the side of the shotgun even when we are out of ammo. Although a select fire prototype of it was made in 2012, the M1216 cannot actually fire in full auto. The modern submachine gun carbine, now known as a joint venture protective carbine, should have a ambidextrous fire selector lever just above the trigger with markings. This is not a Chris K10. The K10 had a detachable magazine well, diagonal reversible charging handle, and a longer barrel. This is instead a Vector with a K10 barrel and not much else. By default, it has a 36 round capacity, when it should be 30 in reality. The MP7A1 Stop Lab from the 20 round magazine is modeled into the grip for some reason. Also, it should eject bottlenecked cartridges instead of the straight walled ones. By default, the Jiangxi 9mm incorrectly fires in burst instead of semi or full auto. It uses an FMG 9's carry handle. It fires with a ridiculous 1250 RPM in contrast with its actual 900 RPM. It has a pseudo-transparent mag. The charging handle position should be on the upper receiver. And the weapon incorrectly holds 36 rounds by default instead of the correct 50. By default, the CZ Scorpion Evo 3A somehow has 32 rounds in its 30 round mag. The magazine lacks proper feed lips. And the visible bullets in the mag are just a static texture that do not deplete. The AN-94 was discontinued in 2006 and was never made available for export, so does not make sense to be seen used so much by non-Russian forces in the campaign. Unlike some of the other weapons present here that were created just before the time this game released, Treyarch had foresight of this fact with the AN-94, since the game was launched 6 years after its discontinuation in 2012. In contrast with the actually used AN-94s, all the ones seen in-game are attached with a rubber recoil butt pad on the stock, a Mission First Tactical Teco Polymer AK-47 integrated rail system, and a RS Regulate AKML Gen 1 Micro Red Dot mount, which instead of mounting its designated aimpoint micro sight, mounts a rail with an aftermarket AK-style rear sight, and has a taller front sight to match, with the weapon still retaining its original, now useless rear sight though. The AN-94 cannot use custom handguards, like the ones compatible with the AK platform. The barrel incorrectly retracts back when pulling the charging handle, and it is incorrectly chambered in 5.56x45 NATO. This gun is technically not an MTAR-21, but a IWI X95 flap top. The SIG 556 model in-game is based on a civilian variant and so should not fire in full auto or burst. It has an MFI SIG MAD front sight, and the standard rear SIG sight is depicted with an aiming aperture instead of the proper drum, with the rear grip also being missing. The DSA SA-58 by default incorrectly holds 25 rounds in a 20-round mag. The ammo in the mag also does not correspond to the ammo remaining. The M8A1 is a futuristic take on the Malaysian model XM8 and uses an enormous thick carry handle, G36 magwell, as well as an early model duckbill flash hider. It features a pseudo-transparent magazine. The XM8 also cannot fire in bursts. In reality, the fire selector should have a white line on it, and the burst fire marking should be full auto. The weapon also holds 32 rounds by default instead of the actual 30 or 100 round mag. In the campaign, the XM8 is seen used as a standard issue among allied forces, despite it being the Malaysian version, with the XM8 also having failed to replace the M16A2 during the mid-2000s. The Type 25 is a futuristic version of the QBZ-95-1 with a QBZ-95 trigger guard. The sight protector has been replaced by a sight rail, and for some reason it also appears again in this game as a separate weapon, incorrectly called the QBB-LSW. This weapon is modeled on the civilian model of the SCAR H known as the FN SCAR 175, meaning it should not fire full auto. It has a static bolt release, its rear sight has been cut in half, and it is incorrectly capable of holding 30 rounds by default in a 20-round mag. This same version of SCAR H appears again incorrectly referred to as the Hammer, with it not including the deeper handguard from the real Hammer IAR. It features a fictional drum mag, as well as having a faster RPM of 937 for its first 7 rounds for some reason. And its bolt does not lock back once empty. And the SCAR is seen ejecting belt links as well. The HK416 is incorrectly called an M27 in-game. The M27 uses a 16.5-inch barrel, while the HK416 uses a 14.5-inch barrel. Its front sight is modeled after the earlier versions. It has a static bolt release, and the ejected mag always has ammo in it regardless of how much ammo was remaining. All of them are equipped with a mag-pull BAD lever, which our character never actually uses when reloading for some reason, a Raptor charging handle, and a 10.5-inch super modular rail HK. The foregrip attachment adds a Surefire 900A vertical foregrip, which has a completely unusable flashlight. And during the draw animation of the HK416, the player character quickly racks the custom charging handle twice. The second pull ejects a single round without actually subtracting one from the magazine. The ammo in the LSAT's belt does not correspond to the ammo remaining. Same goes for the Mark 48 Mod 1. And our character also does not actually press the latches to open the top cover on this weapon. The SVU should lock back once empty. Its Leopold Mark IV CQ/T scope uses the wrong scope reticle. It is fitted with a folded forward Harris style bipod instead of the correct one for a SVU/SVU-AS. And by default it holds 12 rounds despite being modeled with a 10-round mag. In the menu icon, the weapon includes a flash suppressor and shows the bipod being mounted backwards and seemingly floating in the air. The FN Ballista incorrectly holds just 7 rounds despite having a 10-round magazine.
The DSR-50 is incorrectly depicted with 5 rounds per mag instead of 3. And it features a spare magazine on a second magwell, which our character refuses to use even if we run out of ammo. The Mark 153 SMA is incorrectly shown used as a surface-to-air missile launcher, with it firing fictional guided rounds which can lock onto vehicles and aircraft. This behemoth is a modified version of the General Dynamics GAU-19/A and has the same problems as the M134 minigun, being that it is somehow able to be fired from the hip while walking and has no visible power source. The M134 minigun used in this sequence in Achilles Veil does not have any ammo feeding into it, yet still somehow fires. Controlling a sentry gun in the Strike Force missions gives us a view above its GAU-19/A gun, despite the rig's camera being mounted below and to the right of the barrels. The M197 Vulcan cannon we take control of in the Solarium mission is stated to be 40mm, despite clearly not being big enough. The fire selector of the Heckler & Koch M320 grenade launcher is pointed in completely the wrong direction. Our character does not actually load anything into his MGL Mark 1L, and he does not make a full rotation to fully wind up its cylinder either, with mid-cylinder reloads in-game neglecting the fact that the cylinder cannot be manually rotated when it's partially wound up. Also, when reloading, the player character ejects the entire contents of the cylinder, but only inserts as many rounds as would be needed to replace those actually fired. The fictional assault sentry drone tracked UCVs mount a real weapon, being a Metal Storm Redback RWS 4-barrel repeating grenade launcher in a module on the right hand side. But as we can clearly see when we controlled them in the Strike Force missions, the grenade launcher is incorrectly depicted as an ordinary machine gun. The B-23R, PDW-57, SMR, XPR-50, Storm PSR, Futurized RPG, FHJ-18AA, crossbows, and Tetris-6, along with pretty much all the other not yet mentioned weaponry, attachments, grenades, and explosives present throughout these 2025 missions, are all nearly entirely just fictional. A few of them do feature some parts that are based on or somewhat inspired by real weapons. However, they are all overall just futuristic models that Treyarch made up to predict what would be created by 2025. And since the developers did not have a time machine back in 2012 to see just how goofy their idea of technical advancements made by the 2020s would become, it would be unfair and mostly straight up impossible to count as inaccuracies, since they have no direct real-life counterparts. So then, that leaves us with a grand record total of over 360 historical inaccuracies. Before giving a visit to our video covering the plentiful inaccuracies of this game's predecessor, Black Ops 1, remember to use the channel links in the description and pinned comment to download and play the much more historically authentic World War II multiplayer video game of Enlisted, available on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation, all completely free to play. Thank you to Enlisted for sponsoring this video. All key links and resources are in the description. Thanks to our research team including Farizum, Munancho Inc., Adrian Barry, Panzerman, Shen, Patriotic Ugandan, along with the many other dedicated members in our Discord server, and of course my highest of thanks to you for watching this feature film length of a video. This has been the Frosty one, out.